The air in Blackwood, Massachusetts, was thick with the scent of damp earth and coming snow, a biting cold that settled deep in the bones of its inhabitants. It was the autumn of 1876, and the town was a patchwork of stark, grey stone buildings and bare-limbed trees that clawed at a bruised sky. For 11-year-old Mabel Whitlock, the world was a series of muted tones and sharp edges, a stark contrast to the vibrant chaos of her inner mind. Mabel was a child of quiet observation, her world largely confined to the echoing halls of the family mansion. A frail, pale girl with eyes that held a knowing far beyond her years, she was often found in the parlour, hunched over a drawing pad. Her hands, nimble and sure, moved with an almost preternatural grace, sketching portraits of her family members. It was her singular passion, a way to capture the fleeting moments of their lives, or so it seemed. The first portrait she ever drew was of her father, Elias Whitlock, a stern, imposing man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that held the weight of 1,000 ledgers. He was the pillar of their family's wealth and influence. Mabel had worked on it for weeks, meticulously capturing the subtle lines of worry around his mouth and the weary shadow in his gaze. She finished it on a crisp October morning, presenting it to him with a shy smile. Elias, a man of few words, had simply nodded and hung it in his study. 2 days later, the news arrived. Elias had suffered a massive stroke while at his downtown office. He was found slumped over his desk, a half-finished ledger entry beneath his lifeless hand. The doctor said it was a swift, painless end, a culmination of years of stress and a life lived too fast. The family was devastated. Her mother, Eleanor, a woman of refined composure, broke down, her wails echoing through the cavernous house. Mabel, however, remained silent. She simply went to the study and stared at the portrait she had drawn. Her father's eyes in the drawing seemed to stare back, filled with the same weary sadness he had worn in life, as if he knew. The pattern, as all patterns do, started small, unseen. Eleanor, a woman who now lived in a perpetual state of grief, had taken to her bed. Her once vibrant spirit diminished to a flicker. The house, once alive with the subtle hum of a prosperous family, was now a mausoleum of sorrow. Her aunt, Beatrice, a spinster with a sharp tongue and a soft heart, moved in to help manage the household and care for Eleanor. She, more than anyone, saw the peculiar connection. Beatrice was a practical woman. She dismissed the notion of an omen, of a curse, as the idle superstition of a grieving mind. She attributed Elias's death to the rigors of his business and Eleanor's failing health to her heartbreak. But then Mabel started a new portrait. This time, it was of her younger brother, Thomas. Thomas, a boisterous boy of 9, was a whirlwind of energy, his laughter a rare burst of sunshine in the gloom of the house. Mabel's drawing captured him in mid-stride, his face a portrait of youthful abandon, a wild, untamed energy radiating from the charcoal lines. The day Mabel finished the portrait, a thick fog rolled in from the coast, swallowing the town whole. Thomas, defying his mother's strict orders to stay indoors, snuck out to play in the woods behind the house. He never came back. A search party was organized, torches cutting through the thick, soupy air. They found him at the edge of the creek, his foot caught in a root, his head having struck a rock as he fell. The cold, rushing water had done the rest. His portrait, now finished, sat on an easel in the parlor, his wild energy frozen forever on the paper. The air in the house grew heavy, a pall of silent accusation settling over the remaining family. Mabel was no longer just the quiet child with a drawing talent. She was now an enigma, a harbinger of tragedy. Eleanor, her mind fractured by grief, began to look at her daughter with a new, terrified gaze. "You knew," she whispered one evening, her voice thin as a ghost's. "You knew they would die." Mabel's only response was to clutch her drawing pad tighter, her small hands trembling. She didn't know how to explain what she felt. It wasn't a premonition, not a magical vision of the future. It was something else, a compulsion, a feeling of dread that would not release her until the portrait was complete. The act of drawing wasn't a choice. It was a desperate, feverish need to capture the essence of a person before they vanished. The small, quiet town of Blackwood, too, began to talk. The story of the Whitlock girl and her cursed portraits spread like wildfire, whispered in hushed tones in the general store and the church pews. People would cross the street to avoid the Whitlock mansion, a beautiful house that was now seen as a monument to death. The family's reputation, once unassailable, was now stained with the grim hues of morbid curiosity and fear. Mabel, now a pariah in her own home and town, retreated further into herself. Her only solace was her drawing pad, the familiar scratch of charcoal on paper a quiet comfort. She knew what they all thought of her. A monster, a medium of death. But she was just a girl trying to make sense of the world, a world that was closing in on her with every passing moment. The dread returned one cold afternoon. A familiar, suffocating weight settled in her chest, and her hands began to itch. She looked across the parlor, her gaze falling on her aunt, Beatrice. Beatrice, who had been a rock of support, her face a mask of weary strength, now seemed so fragile. Mabel felt the compulsion rise, a desperate, undeniable need to draw. She picked up her pad and her charcoal, the scratching sound a rhythm of inevitability. She didn't want to do it. She didn't want to draw her aunt. But she had no choice. It was the only way she knew how to cope, to capture and contain the creeping feeling of a final farewell. As her hands began to move, a profound sadness settled over her. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the portrait she was about to draw would be her aunt's last. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel to not miss any of the upcoming chapters. Your support helps bring more chilling tales to life. Beatrice saw the shift in Mabel's expression, the sudden, distant look that settled over her niece's face. It was the same look she had worn before drawing Elias and Thomas. A quiet dread coiled in Beatrice's stomach, but she pushed it down, a fierce pragmatism battling the rising panic. She tried to distract Mabel, to break the spell. "Mabel, dear, would you like some hot cocoa? It's getting quite cold in here." Mabel didn't respond. Her focus was absolute, her gaze fixed on Beatrice. Her hand, holding a piece of charcoal, was steady, but the rest of her body was tense, coiled like a spring. Beatrice's heart began to beat a panicked rhythm against her ribs. She saw the first strokes on the paper, a quick, confident line that outlined her profile. Beatrice tried to rationalize. "Mabel, put that down. It's not a good time. I have to go check on your mother." But the words were a plea, not a command, and Mabel paid them no mind. She was in a world of her own, a world where only the charcoal and the paper existed. Beatrice watched in a frozen terror as the portrait took shape. Mabel's depiction of her was not what she expected. It wasn't a portrait of her weary face or the lines of worry around her eyes. Instead, Mabel captured her in a moment of quiet strength, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on her lips, her gaze directed towards a distant, unseen point. It was her most beautiful and haunting portrait yet. It was a picture of someone at peace. When Mabel finally dropped the charcoal, her small body slumped in exhaustion. The portrait was finished. Beatrice stared at it, a wave of cold realization washing over her. It wasn't a warning of death. It was a final testament to life. Her life, in all its quiet strength and unacknowledged grace, had been captured. That evening, the Whitlock mansion was plunged into a deeper, more profound gloom. The wind howled outside, a mournful song that seemed to echo the sorrow within. Beatrice, unable to sleep, decided to check the gas lamps in the cellar. The cellar of the old house was a labyrinth of shadows and cobwebs, its air heavy with the scent of mildew and decaying wood. As she descended the stone steps, her oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows, her foot caught on a loose step. She tumbled, the lamp flying from her hand, its flame snuffed out as it shattered against the cold stone floor. Beatrice fell, a sharp pain shooting up her leg, and then darkness. When she was found hours later, the cold had set in. and her breathing was shallow. She died in her sleep, a broken ankle having led to a fatal case of hypothermia. Eleanor, the last of the adults, was now completely unhinged. She refused to leave her room, barricading herself inside, her screams of grief and terror a constant chilling sound in the house. She blamed Mabel directly, her grief turning into a poisonous hatred. "You killed them. You killed them all with your cursed drawings," she shrieked from behind her locked door, the words cutting through the silence like shards of glass. Mabel was left to wander the house, a ghost in her own home. The servants, loyal as they were, looked at her with pity and fear, their movements around her cautious and guarded. Her only friend in this desolate landscape was the quiet, old gardener, Mr. Abernathy, a man of silent wisdom and gnarled hands. He had been with the family for decades. He never spoke about the portraits, never looked at her with fear. He simply offered her small, kind gestures, a cup of tea, a warm blanket, a shared moment of silence in the garden. He was the only one who saw the terrified child behind the stoic facade. One day, as Mabel sat on a cold stone bench in the garden, a fresh sheet of paper on her lap, she felt the familiar dread. She looked up and saw Mr. Abernathy tending to a rose bush, his gnarled hands gentle with the delicate thorns. She knew with a heartbreaking certainty that it was his turn. Her hand began to tremble, and she felt a wave of nausea. She couldn't do it. She couldn't bear the thought of him, the only one who showed her kindness, being a victim of her terrible affliction. She tried to fight it. She stood up, her body shaking, and tried to run away. But the compulsion was too strong. It was a physical force, pulling her back to the bench, back to the paper. She had to capture him. She had to draw him. She had to complete the final portrait. Mr. Abernathy looked up, his kind eyes finding hers. He saw the terror on her face, the charcoal trembling in her hand. He saw the unfinished outline of his own face on the paper, and for the first time, he didn't smile. He simply nodded, a slow, resigned motion. He understood. He saw the burden she carried, the terrible weight of this knowledge. Mabel began to draw, her movements jerky at first, then gaining a feverish, desperate speed. She drew him as he was, a man of the earth, his face etched with the lines of a life lived outdoors, his hands scarred and calloused from a lifetime of labor. But she also drew something more, a deep sense of peace, a quiet acceptance in his gaze. The last of the Whitlocks were now an 11-year-old girl, and her insane mother, isolated in a grand, empty house. The town, once a source of comfort and community, had become a prison of silent judgment. Mabel was on her own, a child navigating a world that had become a minefield of sorrow and loss. She knew the pattern now, knew it with a chilling clarity. The portraits were not the cause of the deaths. They were a symptom, a terrifying, beautiful record of a life about to end. The question remained, what was the true cause? What was connecting these tragic events? The portrait of Mr. Abernathy was a masterpiece of quiet sorrow. It depicted him with a gentle smile, his eyes holding a profound sense of peace. He looked like a man ready to rest after a long and fruitful journey. When Mabel finished, she felt a profound sense of exhaustion and a deep, crushing guilt. She had captured the essence of the only person who had ever truly seen her. And now, he was gone. The next morning, Mr. Abernathy was found in the garden shed, a heart attack having taken him swiftly and without pain. The silence in the Whitlock mansion was now absolute, broken only by the sporadic, high-pitched shrieks from Eleanor's locked room. Mabel was truly alone. She now existed in a self-imposed exile within her own home, a prisoner of her grim gift. She spent her days wandering the cavernous rooms, her footsteps echoing in the silence, her drawing pad a constant, grim companion. The money from her father's estate was more than enough to keep the house running, but the house itself was a source of fear. The remaining servants, under the silent threat of the curse, kept their distance. They communicated with her through hushed instructions and placed meals outside her door. They were terrified of being the next subject of her art. One afternoon, In a moment of utter desperation, Mabel decided to stop drawing. She would not create another portrait, not for anyone. She would break the terrible cycle, starve the curse of its fuel. She took all her charcoal and paper and locked it in a chest in her room. She would not draw again. The first day was filled with a nervous, desperate relief. The air felt lighter, the oppressive weight on her chest slightly lifted. She wandered the halls, trying to find a way to occupy her mind, a way to keep the terrible compulsion at bay. She read books, played the old piano in the parlor, anything to distract herself. But the itch was there, a phantom pain in her hands, a deep-seated dread that grew with every passing hour. The second day, the dread became a physical sensation. Her hands trembled, her fingers aching for the feel of the charcoal. She felt a profound sense of unease, a gnawing anxiety that something terrible was about to happen. She tried to tell herself it was just her mind playing tricks on her, a psychological byproduct of the tragedies she had witnessed. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on a ticking clock, and that by refusing to draw, she was merely delaying the inevitable. On the third day, the screams from her mother's room became more frequent and more frantic. They were no longer screams of grief, but of a different kind of terror. Mabel, her own mind strained to its breaking point, found herself standing outside the locked door. "Mother?" she whispered, her voice a small, wavering sound. There was no response, only a series of panicked whimpers. A chilling fear seized Mabel. She had not drawn her mother. She had not had the compulsion. Was the curse broken? Or had something else entirely happened? She called for the servants, but they had long since learned to ignore the screams, convinced Eleanor's madness was a permanent fixture. Mabel, her heart pounding in her chest, had to take matters into her own hands. She found the key to her mother's room, a key the servants had hidden, convinced that Eleanor would one day harm herself. Mabel unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was a mess, the curtains drawn, the air stale and heavy. Eleanor was huddled in a corner, her hair disheveled, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. Her body was racked with shivers, her hands trembling uncontrollably. She was pointing a shaking finger at something behind Mabel. Mabel turned, her blood running cold. There, on the wall, was a portrait. Not one of hers, but an old one, a faded charcoal drawing of her grandfather, the founder of the Whitlock family fortune. It was a beautiful portrait, filled with a quiet dignity. Eleanor's voice, a hoarse whisper, came from the corner. "He's coming. He's coming for us all." Mabel was baffled. Her grandfather had died years ago, long before she was born. This portrait was an old family heirloom. But then she looked closer at the portrait, and a detail she had never noticed before caught her eye. The signature. It was not her grandfather's, but her grandmother's, Eleanor's mother. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The drawings weren't just hers. This grim cycle had been happening for generations. The door to her room creaked shut behind her, a gust of wind from an open window causing it to swing on its hinges. The sound, a simple creak, was deafening in the silence. It was then that Mabel noticed the new portrait on her drawing pad, the one she had locked away. It was a drawing of her mother. Not the old, frail woman she was now, but the beautiful, vibrant woman she had once been. Her face full of life and joy, a picture of a past she would never return to. The drawing was not in her style, it was in her grandmother's style. And it was signed. Mabel stood frozen, the terrible realization dawning on her. It wasn't the portraits that were the problem. It was the Whitlock family itself. There was a curse, not of the supernatural, but of the psychological. Her mother's family, the artist side, carried a terrible affliction. They were not mediums for the dead. They were mediums for the living. They were not cursed with a vision of the future. They were cursed with the ability to see a person's life in its entirety, to see their true self, their most fundamental essence, the moment before it was irrevocably altered. Her father had been stressed to the breaking point. His portrait showed his exhaustion before he died from it. Her brother had been a wild, untamable force. His portrait captured that energy just before he died in a moment of unrestrained freedom. Her aunt was a woman of quiet strength who was at peace with her life. Her portrait captured that peace before she died a quiet, peaceful death. Mr. Abernathy was a man of the earth who had lived his life fully. His portrait showed him at rest, just before he died a sudden, quiet death. And now her mother, a woman who had once been full of life and joy, had been reduced to a frightened, broken shell. Her portrait, drawn by a mysterious, unknown hand, captured the moment before her spirit broke. The drawings were not a cause, but a record. A terrible, psychological record of the moment a person's life ended, and a new one, defined by an inescapable reality, began. The real monster wasn't the drawing, but the knowledge. The unbearable knowledge of seeing the end of a person's life before it happened. The terror wasn't in the act of creation, but in the truth it revealed. And now, she realized, the curse was her own. She was not a medium for death, she was a medium for life, and the knowledge was slowly driving her to madness. Mabel's mind reeled. The drawing on the pad was a stark testament to a hidden history. It was her mother, but a woman she had never known, vibrant and full of life. It was signed with her grandmother's initials, a name Mabel had only seen on old documents and family portraits. The realization was a devastating blow. The terror wasn't in some external force, but in a hereditary affliction, a cruel irony passed down through the female line of the family. The drawings weren't foretelling death. They were capturing the final, most defining essence of a person before a life-altering event. Her father's portrait captured his ultimate exhaustion, the very thing that led to his fatal stroke. Her brother's portrait depicted his wild spirit, the very thing that led him to his tragic fall. Her aunt's portrait was a picture of her inner peace, an acceptance of her quiet life, moments before her quiet, unexpected end. And Mr. Abernathy's portrait captured the serenity of a life well lived, a peaceful resignation that preceded his peaceful heart attack. The portrait of her mother, the one she had just discovered, was not of her current self, broken by grief and fear. It was a portrait of a woman on the brink of happiness, a joy she would never feel again. It captured the exact moment her spirit was about to be shattered, before the pain of Elias's death and Thomas's accident consumed her. Her grandmother hadn't been drawing death. She had been drawing the moment a life ended and a new, terrible reality began. The realization settled over Mabel with a cold certainty. The drawings weren't a curse. They were a gift, a terrifying one, that allowed the artist to see the true essence of a person, to capture a moment in time before it was lost forever. But the knowledge that came with this gift was a burden no one could bear. It wasn't a premonition of death, but an understanding of the final, defining moments of a life, a moment that would lead to its end. The screaming from Eleanor's room grew louder, more frantic. Mabel, her mind now clear with this terrible knowledge, understood. Her mother wasn't just grieving, she was unraveling. The shock of her grandmother's portrait, the very one that had captured her spirit before it broke, was pushing her over the edge. Eleanor was not just a victim of a curse, she was a victim of her own mind, a mind that was now breaking under the weight of a lifetime of suppressed trauma and loss. Mabel stood up, her small body trembling with a mixture of terror and resolve. The truth was not supernatural, it was psychological. The Whitlock family was not cursed by a mediumistic power, they were afflicted by a unique form of heightened empathy and artistic perception, a sensitivity so profound it could capture the essence of a soul. And that knowledge, that terrible knowledge of an impending end, was a burden that was too heavy to carry. She walked slowly to her mother's door, the old key cold and heavy in her hand. The screams had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whimpering. Mabel pushed open the door and entered the room. The air was thick and stale, and the curtains were drawn, plunging the room into a deep, unsettling gloom. Eleanor was no longer cowering in the corner. She was standing by the window, her body swaying, her hand clutching a small, tarnished locket. "Mother," Mabel whispered, her voice a small sound in the vast silence. Eleanor didn't respond. She just stared at the locket, her eyes wide with a frantic, unseeing gaze. She opened the locket, and Mabel saw a tiny portrait inside. It was of a young woman, a striking resemblance to her mother, but with a different kind of sadness in her eyes. Mabel's grandmother. It was a self-portrait, and the expression on her face was one of profound resignation, a silent plea. Suddenly, Eleanor's body went rigid. Her eyes darted from the locket to Mabel, a spark of recognition, and then a wave of pure, unadulterated terror. "You have it too," she choked out, her voice a reedy whisper. "The knowledge. It's in your blood." Mabel didn't deny it. She couldn't. She finally understood. The curse wasn't in the drawings. It was in their very being. The drawings were simply the outward manifestation of an internal process, a terrifying ability to see into the heart of a person. Eleanor, her face a mask of grief and madness, lunged at her, her movements a parody of a mother's embrace. Mabel, startled, stumbled backward, her hand flying to the small hidden satchel she always carried with her, the one she kept her new drawing supplies in, an act of defiance against her own terror. Her mother fell, her foot catching on a loose rug. She tumbled, her head hitting the edge of a heavy oak dresser with a sickening thud. The locket flew from her grasp, skittering across the floor. Eleanor's body went limp, her head lolling at an unnatural angle. A small dark stain began to spread across the polished wood floor. Mabel stood frozen, the reality of what had just happened a cold, brutal shock. Her mother was dead, not by some supernatural curse, but by a tragic, mundane accident, a terrible climax to a life of grief and madness. She looked at her drawing pad, the one she had locked away. She had not had the compulsion to draw her mother. The compulsion had been to draw her aunt and Mr. Abernathy. The terrible knowledge was that her mother's life had already been irrevocably altered, her spirit already broken. There was nothing left to capture. A profound, chilling silence descended upon the house. Mabel was truly alone. No family left, only the portraits and the terrible, silent knowledge that came with them. She was the last of her line, the last to carry this burden. The question that haunted her now was not what would happen to her, but what she would do with this terrible knowledge. Would she succumb to the same madness that consumed her mother and grandmother, or would she find a way to break the cycle, to find a truth that was not so terrifying? The answer lay not in the supernatural, but in the dark, twisted history of her family. The silence that followed Eleanor's death was more profound than any silence Mabel had ever known. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a heavy, suffocating stillness that settled in every corner of the vast, empty house. The servants, hearing the commotion and now seeing a lifeless body, packed their bags and left, their fear finally outweighing their loyalty. They didn't even bother to collect their final pay. Mabel, now an orphan, was left with a dead mother and a house full of ghosts. Not the kind that haunt you, but the kind that you carry with you. The memory of a father's weary eyes, a brother's wild laughter, an aunt's quiet strength, and a mother's broken spirit. The town, upon hearing the news, reacted with a grim mixture of pity and terror. The story of the Whitlock curse, once a morbid curiosity, was now a chilling reality. The few people who still had contact with the family now cut all ties. The Whitlock mansion became an island of sorrow and a monument to a family that had destroyed itself from the inside out. Mabel, left to her own devices, took to wandering the halls, her mind a whirlwind of grief and terrifying truths. She no longer had the compulsion to draw. The dread had not returned, and she realized with a chilling certainty why. There was no one left to draw. The curse, if you could call it that, had run its course. The last of her family, broken by grief and circumstance, had fallen. She found herself in her grandmother's old study, a room she had always been forbidden from entering. The door, once locked, had been left ajar by a panicked servant. Inside, the room was a time capsule. Old books lined the shelves, their spines cracked and faded. A large, ornate desk sat in the center of the room, and on its surface, covered in a thick layer of dust, was a stack of journals. Mabel hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling. This room, this person, held the answers. She felt a profound sense of fear, a terror that the truth would be even more horrifying than she imagined. But her innate curiosity, her desperate need to understand the source of her family's misery, won out. She opened the top journal, the pages yellowed with age, and began to read. The journals were her grandmother's, a detailed account of a life lived under a terrible burden. She wrote of her childhood, of the moments she would feel a strange, terrible urge to draw a person. She described how, after the drawing was finished, something would happen to that person, a profound and life-altering event that would change them forever. She wrote of her father, a kind, brilliant man who had died from a sudden stroke after she had drawn him, her portrait capturing the moment his spirit was finally broken by the stress of his business. She wrote of her brother, a wild and adventurous spirit who had died in a climbing accident after she had drawn his portrait, a picture of his untamed freedom. Her grandmother's journals were a mirror of Mabel's own life, a horrifying repetition of events. But the journals also held a deeper, more chilling truth. Her grandmother wrote of her own mother, who had also had the gift, and her mother before her. The gift, the curse, was passed down through the female line of the family, a secret kept hidden from the men, a burden borne in silent solitude. The journals revealed that the family had been afflicted for generations. The men, ignorant of the curse, would unknowingly trigger the events by their own actions. The women, with their terrible gift of foresight, would capture the moment before the inevitable tragedy. Her grandmother wrote of her own mother's descent into madness, of her final act of defiance, her suicide. She had drawn a self-portrait, a picture of a broken woman, before she ended her own life. Mabel felt a cold sickness rise in her throat. She had found the truth, but it was a truth more terrifying than any ghost story. Her family was not cursed by a demon or a phantom. They were cursed by their own minds. The women of her family were so sensitive, so perceptive, that they could see the moment a person's spirit would break, the final moment of their authentic self before they were transformed by grief, by loss, by despair. The drawings were not a medium for the dead. They were a medium for a new kind of living death, the death of the soul. And now, she realized, she was the last one, the last to bear this burden. She was not just a victim of circumstance, but a victim of a genetic, psychological affliction. The question was no longer what she would do with her gift, but how she would survive it. The journals held no answer to this. Her grandmother had offered no solution, only a tragic, final act of defiance. Mabel, her body shaking, turned to a new journal, a newer one, the pages still pristine. It was her mother, Eleanor's journal. Her hand trembled as she opened it. The first page was a drawing of a young, handsome man, her father, Elias, with a smile on his face, full of a life she never knew. Her mother's entry was a simple, chilling line. "I drew him. My father told me I had to. It's the only way to save them. The drawings are a warning. We can stop it." Mabel's heart pounded. A warning. Could this be the key? Could the drawings be more than just a record of a tragedy, but a way to prevent it? She turned the page, her eyes scanning the neat, elegant handwriting. Her mother's story was not of a curse, but of a desperate, futile attempt to break it. Eleanor's journal was a lifeline in the sea of madness and despair that had consumed her family. She wrote not of a curse, but of a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to understand and break a terrible cycle. Her entries were full of hope and frustration, of a profound love for her family and a chilling dread of her own gift. She wrote of her childhood, of her mother teaching her to draw, not just for pleasure, but for a purpose. Her mother, Mabel's grandmother, believed the drawings were not omens of death, but warnings of a life-altering event. She believed that by recognizing the defining moment in a person's life, they could prevent it from spiraling into tragedy. But she had been wrong. The knowledge was a burden, not a tool, and the cycle continued. Eleanor, however, had refused to give up. She had married Elias, a man of logic and reason, and had kept her gift a secret. She believed that with her intellect and her father's wealth, she could find a way to stop the inevitable. She wrote of her feverish attempts to study psychology, to understand the intricacies of the human mind, to find a pattern in the events that followed her drawings. But there was no pattern, just a series of tragic coincidences, a devastating string of events that seemed to confirm the supernatural nature of the curse. She wrote of the day Mabel was born, of the mixture of joy and terror she felt. She had seen the same sensitivity, the same keen observation in her daughter's eyes that she had seen in her own. She had tried to suppress it, to keep Mabel away from art, from anything that would awaken the gift, but it was in their blood. Mabel, with her quiet, observant nature, had found her way to a drawing pad, and the cycle had begun anew. Eleanor's last entry was a desperate, heartbreaking plea to her daughter. Mabel, if you are reading this, do not believe the ghosts. Do not believe the curse. There is no magic, no premonition, only a terrible knowledge. The drawings are not the cause. The fear is. The fear of this terrible gift, the fear of seeing what is coming, is what drives us to madness. I tried to warn them, but they thought I was crazy. I tried to warn you, but you wouldn't listen. Please, my sweet girl, do not be afraid. The truth is not in the drawing, but in the life it depicts. Find the truth, my darling. Don't let the fear consume you. Mabel closed the journal, her hands trembling. Her mother's words were a revelation. The fear was the real enemy. The fear that turned a heightened perception into a curse, a gift into a burden. Her family hadn't been killed by the drawings. They had been killed by circumstance, and the drawings had simply captured the moment before the inevitable happened. And the fear of this knowledge had driven her mother to a madness that had led to her tragic end. The truth was a heavy weight, but it was also a liberation. Mabel was not a medium for death. She was a child with a profound artistic sensitivity, a perception so keen she could capture the very essence of a person. She could see the despair in her father's eyes before he gave in to it. She could see the untamed spirit in her brother before it led to his accident. She could see the quiet grace in her aunt before she died a peaceful death. She could see the broken spirit in her mother before she succumbed to her madness. The knowledge, however, was still a terrifying burden. What was she supposed to do with it? She was still a child, alone in a desolate house, with the weight of her family's history on her shoulders. She had no one to talk to, no one to share her terrible truth with. The fear, though now understood, was still there, a constant shadow that loomed over her. Mabel stood, the journals clutched to her chest, and walked back to her own room. She looked at the portraits she had drawn, now a grim gallery of her lost family. They were not monuments to death, but to a series of tragic, yet ultimately human events. Her father's portrait was a picture of a man who worked himself to death. Her brother's portrait was a picture of a boy who died an innocent, tragic death. Her aunt's portrait was a picture of a woman who was at peace with her life. Her mother's portrait, the one drawn by her grandmother, was a picture of a woman whose spirit was about to be broken. The realization settled over her. The curse was a lie, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Her family had been so consumed by the fear of their gift that they had not seen the truth. The drawings were not the cause of the tragedies, but the human drama that unfolded around them. The terrible knowledge was not a magical power, but a psychological burden. And now, a new dread set in. There was a portrait of her in her grandmother's journal, drawn by her mother. It was of a little girl, maybe 5 or 6, with a profound sadness in her eyes. The caption was a single word: fear. Her mother had seen the fear in her, the same fear that had consumed her. The fear of being different, of knowing too much, of being a harbinger of tragedy. Mabel, now facing her own portrait of sorrow, made a choice. She would not be a victim of fear. She would not succumb to the same madness that had consumed her family. She would face the truth, however painful it was, and she would find a way to live with it. The first step was to leave the house, to leave the past behind and build a new life for herself. The second step was to use her gift, not as a curse, but as a tool for understanding, for empathy, for connection. She would not be Mabel the medium. She would be Mabel the artist. Mabel's decision to leave the house was not an easy one. It was the only home she had ever known, a place filled with both the most cherished and the most agonizing memories of her short life. But it was also a tomb, a monument to a past she needed to escape. She spent the next few days preparing, gathering the essentials, her drawing supplies, the journals of her grandmother and mother, and what little money she could find in the family safe. The portraits, a gallery of her family's final moments, she left behind. They were not to be forgotten, but to be left in their rightful place, as a testament to the lives they represented, not the deaths they preceded. With her small satchel over her shoulder, she stepped out of the house into the cold, crisp air of a Blackwood morning. The townspeople, who had once whispered about her, now looked away, their pity mixed with a palpable sense of relief. She was a ghost, a reminder of a story they wished to forget. Mabel, however, did not care. She was free, free from the silent judgment, free from the suffocating history of the Whitlock family. Her first destination was the local orphanage. She had no family left, no one to turn to. She was a child with no home, and the orphanage was the only logical place for her to go. The matron, a kind but weary woman named Mrs. Albright, listened to her story with a grim mixture of pity and disbelief. She didn't believe in curses, but she had lived in Blackwood long enough to know the Whitlock story. She looked at the small, frail girl, her eyes holding the knowledge of a lifetime of sorrow, and took her in. Life at the orphanage was a stark contrast to the opulence of the Whitlock mansion. The food was bland, the beds were hard, and the privacy she had once known was a distant memory. But for Mabel, it was a place of hope. It was a new beginning. She made a conscious decision to not draw, to not let the fear of her gift consume her. She spent her days helping Mrs. Albright, reading to the younger children, and studying the books in the small library. She wanted to understand the human mind, to understand the intricacies of emotion and trauma, to understand the very things that had destroyed her family. She learned about grief, about how it could manifest in many different ways. She learned about the effects of prolonged stress, of how it could break a person's body and mind. She learned about trauma and how it could consume a person's identity, turning them into a shell of their former self. The books were her teachers, and the orphanage was her new school. She began to see the world not through the eyes of a cursed medium, but through the eyes of a keen observer, a budding psychologist. The compulsion to draw still came, a familiar itch in her hands, a profound sense of dread that something was about to happen. But she no longer gave in to it. She would close her eyes, breathe deeply, and tell herself that it was just her mind, a byproduct of a lifetime of tragedy. She would focus on the faces of the children around her, their innocent joy, their simple sorrows. She would focus on their lives, not on their ends. One day, as she was reading to a small, frail boy named Henry, she felt the familiar dread. She looked at him, his face pale and thin, and saw a future of a different kind of pain. She saw a boy who would be consumed by an illness that would keep him in bed for the rest of his life. The urge to draw was overwhelming. It was not a premonition of death, but of a life forever changed. But she resisted. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She told herself that she could not change what was coming, but she could change what she did with that knowledge. Instead of drawing him, she told him a story about a boy who was sick, but who found a way to be happy, to find joy in the small things. She used her gift not to create a monument to his suffering, but to give him a sense of hope. The boy's eyes lit up, and he smiled. It was a simple act, But for Mabel, it was a profound victory. She had used her gift not to foresee a tragedy, but to offer a comfort. She had turned a curse into a kindness. The town, however, was not ready to let go of its ghost. The story of the Whitlock girl had become a legend, a grim bedtime story told to children to scare them into behaving. One evening, a group of older boys from the town, their faces a mixture of bravado and fear, came to the orphanage, their voices loud and menacing. "Mabel the medium, Mabel the medium," they chanted, their words a cruel echo of the whispers she had left behind. They taunted her, calling her a witch, a killer. Mabel, her body trembling with a mixture of terror and anger, stood her ground. She was no longer a frightened child. She was a survivor. She looked at them, not with fear, but with a profound sense of pity. She saw their bravado as a shield, a cover for their own insecurities, their own fear of the unknown. She saw their fear, not for her, but for themselves. And in that moment, she understood the true nature of her gift. It was not about seeing the future. It was about seeing the truth behind the masks people wore. If you are enjoying this story, please subscribe to the channel to not miss any of the upcoming chapters. Your support helps bring more chilling tales to life. The boys' taunts were a bitter reminder that no matter how far she ran, the past would always be with her. The town of Blackwood was a small place, and rumors once started were difficult to extinguish. But Mabel, now in control of her gift, no longer felt the crippling fear that had consumed her family. She stood her ground, her gaze steady, her mind calm. She did not see a group of bullies. She saw a group of frightened boys, their bravado a thin veneer over their own anxieties. She saw the truth behind their cruelty, and it was a truth she understood all too well. Her newfound control, however, did not diminish the burden. She still felt the compulsion to draw, the terrible knowledge of a person's defining moment, still a constant shadow in her life. But now, she had a choice. She could either succumb to the fear, or she could use her gift for a different purpose. She chose the latter. Mabel began to draw again, but not as a medium for a curse. She drew as an artist, as a keen observer of the human condition. She would sit in the town square, her drawing pad on her lap, and sketch the people she saw. A woman haggling with a vendor, her face a mask of weary determination. A young couple, their faces alight with a new love, their hands intertwined. An old man, his eyes full of a lifetime of memories, his hands gnarled and trembling. Her drawings were not of death, but of life. They were a testament to the quiet dramas that unfolded around her every day. Her art became a way for her to connect with the world, a way for her to understand the very things that had once terrified her. People, once afraid of her, now began to approach her with a newfound curiosity. They saw the beauty in her art, the way she captured a moment in time, the truth behind a person's expression. They did not know the terrible knowledge that came with her gift, but they saw the humanity in her work. One day, a man approached her, his face a mask of grief. He had heard the stories, but he had also seen her work, and he was desperate. He asked her to draw a portrait of his deceased wife. He wanted to remember her as she was, not as a victim of a terrible illness. Mabel, her heart heavy with empathy, agreed. She asked him to tell her about his wife, to tell her about her life, her passions, her dreams. She learned that his wife had been a kind, gentle soul who had dedicated her life to helping others. She had been a ray of sunshine in the lives of everyone she had touched. But she had also been a woman who had carried a great sorrow, a quiet, unspoken sadness that had consumed her in her final years. Mabel felt the familiar compulsion, the terrible knowledge of the woman's final moments. She saw the moment her spirit had finally surrendered to her illness, a quiet acceptance in her eyes. But instead of drawing that moment, she chose to draw the moment before it, the moment of her true essence. She drew a portrait of a woman full of life, her face a picture of serene grace, her eyes full of a quiet hope. It was a beautiful portrait, a testament to a life well lived. The man looked at it, his eyes filling with tears. "That's her," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "That's my Mary. You captured her. You captured the woman I loved." Mabel had done it. She had used her gift not to create a monument to death, but to create a monument to life. She had turned a curse into a kindness. She had found a way to live with her terrible knowledge, to use it not to terrify, but to heal. The fame of Mabel the artist began to spread, far beyond the confines of Blackwood. People from neighboring towns, hearing of her gift, would come to her, not for a prophecy, but for a portrait. They wanted her to capture the essence of their loved ones, to capture the truth behind their faces. She became known as the artist who saw the soul, who could capture the essence of a person in a single drawing. But with the fame came a new kind of fear. There were still those who believed in the curse, who saw her gift not as a talent, but as a harbinger of death. They whispered about her, warning people to stay away, to not let her draw them. The psychological pressure was immense. She was constantly on guard, constantly aware of the terrible truth she carried. She still saw the moments, the defining moments of people's lives, and the knowledge was still a heavy burden. But she was no longer alone in her struggle. One of the orphanage's doctors, a kind and intelligent man named Dr. Alistair, took an interest in her work. He saw the psychological depth of her art, the way she could capture a person's inner turmoil, their hidden sorrows, their quiet joys. He saw the fear in her eyes, and he understood. He had read her mother's journal, a copy of which she had given to him, and he understood the unique psychological affliction that plagued her family. He did not see a witch or a medium, but a young girl with a profound, almost supernatural artistic talent. He began to work with her, helping her to understand her gift, not as a curse, but as a unique form of heightened empathy. He taught her to separate the knowledge from the fear, to understand that she was not the cause of the tragedies, but simply a witness to them. He helped her to find a way to live with her gift, to use it not as a source of torment, but as a source of strength. He was her first true friend, a lifeline in a world that had once seemed so cold and lonely. Dr. Alistair became Mabel's mentor and confidant. He was the first person to truly understand the burden she carried, to see beyond the town's grim tales and the family's tragic history. He helped her reframe her gift, to see it not as a premonition of death, but as a profound psychological insight. He taught her to observe, to analyze, and to understand the human condition with a new perspective. He explained that the compulsion she felt was a deep, subconscious connection to the emotions of those around her. Her art was a way for her to process and externalize these intense feelings. The defining moment she captured was often a climax of a person's internal struggle, a moment of profound change that was a culmination of their life's events. Her father's portrait captured his final exhaustion, a breaking point from which he could not recover. Her brother's portrait captured his untamed spirit, the very thing that led him to his ultimate recklessness. Dr. Alistair's guidance gave Mabel a new sense of purpose. She began to see her art not as a grim record of impending doom, but as a tool for empathy and understanding. She started using her drawings to help people. She would draw portraits of the children at the orphanage, capturing their quiet fears and their hidden hopes. She would then share these insights with Mrs. Albright and the other caretakers, helping them to better understand and care for the children. She was a silent, unacknowledged therapist, a kind of psychological portraitist. Her fame grew, not just as a talented artist, but as a person with an almost mystical ability to understand people. People sought her out, not to know their future, but to understand their present. They would come to her with their sorrows, their anxieties, their secrets, and she would listen. She would then draw their portrait, and in it, they would see a part of themselves they had never seen before. A hidden strength, a quiet sorrow, a forgotten joy. Her portraits were a mirror to the soul, and her art was a way for people to confront their own truths. Mabel, now a young woman, was no longer the fragile child who had been a ghost in her own home. She was a woman of quiet strength, her eyes holding the knowledge of a lifetime of sorrow, but also a profound sense of compassion. She had found a way to turn her terrible burden into a tool for good. She had found a way to use her gift not as a curse, but as a blessing. She was still an orphan, but she was no longer alone. She had Dr. Alistair, Mrs. Albright, and the children of the orphanage, her new family. But the past, as it always does, had a way of returning. A letter arrived one day, a letter from an old law firm. It was an inheritance notice. Her father's will, which had been held in probate since his death, had finally been settled. The house, the money, the family fortune, it was all hers. The weight of her family's past, which she had so desperately tried to escape, was now back, with a vengeance. Mabel, her heart a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, went to Dr. Alistair for advice. "I don't want it," she said, her voice trembling. "It's a curse. That house. It's a tomb." Dr. Alistair listened to her, his gaze kind and understanding. "The house is not the curse, Mabel," he said gently. "The curse was the fear. The house is just a house. It's a place of memories, but it can also be a place of new beginnings. You have the power now. You can change the story. You can turn that tomb into a home." Mabel thought about his words. She thought about her family, their lives consumed by fear, their stories ending in tragedy. She thought about her own life, how she had fought to break free from the cycle. She realized that running away was not enough. She had to face the past, to confront the ghosts, to truly put them to rest. She decided to go back to the house, to face her past, to confront the place that had been a tomb of sorrow for her family. She did not go alone. Dr. Alistair, Mrs. Albright, and a few of the older children from the orphanage went with her. They would help her turn the house into a place of hope, a place of new beginnings. As she stood at the front door of the Whitlock mansion, the memories, both good and bad, rushed over her. She saw her father, a stern but loving man. She saw her brother, his face alive with a wild, untamed energy. She saw her aunt, a woman of quiet strength. She saw her mother, her face a mask of grief and madness. And she saw herself, a small, frail child, with a drawing pad and a terrible secret. But she also saw a new future, a future of hope, of healing, of love. She saw a future where the house was filled not with the echoes of sorrow, but with the sounds of children's laughter. A future where her gift was not a curse, but a tool for compassion. She opened the front door and stepped inside, ready to face her past and to build a new future for herself and her new family. The Whitlock mansion, once a tomb of sorrow and a monument to a family's demise, was now a place of hope. Mabel, with the help of Dr. Alistair, Mrs. Albright, and the children from the orphanage, transformed the grand, empty house into a home. They turned the dusty parlor into a vibrant playroom, the echoing halls into a gallery for children's art, and the sprawling gardens into a place of laughter and play. Mabel became the matron of the house, a young, wise woman who had faced her demons and emerged victorious. Her art studio, once a place of silent terror, was now a place of quiet creation. She still felt the compulsion to draw, the terrible knowledge of a person's defining moments, still a constant presence in her life. But now, she did not fear it. She embraced it. She used her art not as a medium for death, but as a medium for life. She would draw the portraits of the children she cared for, not of their tragic pasts or their uncertain futures, but of their inner strength, their quiet resilience, their boundless hope. She would show them the beauty in their own souls, the hidden strengths they didn't know they possessed. Her art became a form of therapy, a way for her to heal the wounds of their past and to help them build a new future. The town, which had once feared her, now saw her as a beacon of hope. The story of the Whitlock curse, once a grim tale of a family's destruction, was now a story of a family's redemption. The house, which had once been shunned, was now a place of comfort and community. The townspeople, their fear replaced by gratitude, would donate food, clothes, and books to the children of the orphanage. their small acts of kindness a testament to the change Mabel had brought about. Mabel and Dr. Alistair's relationship deepened, their shared understanding of the human mind and its complexities a bond that transcended friendship. He continued to help her, to guide her, to help her understand her gift, not as a supernatural power, but as a unique form of human empathy. He saw her not as a medium or a witch, but as a remarkable woman with a profound talent. One day, as Mabel was sketching in the garden, she felt the familiar dread. She looked up and saw Dr. Alistair, his kind eyes full of a new, profound emotion she had never seen before. She felt the compulsion to draw him, and for the first time, she did not feel fear. She felt a profound sense of peace. She saw him not as a man who was about to die, but as a man who was about to begin a new, a different, and a wonderful life. She began to draw him, her hand steady, her heart full. She drew him as he was, a man of quiet intelligence and profound kindness. But she also drew something more. She drew the man he would become, a man full of love, a man who had found his own purpose, his own redemption. She drew a man who had found a home and a family in the most unexpected of places. When she finished the portrait, she showed it to him. He looked at it, his eyes filling with tears. "You drew me," he said, his voice a low whisper. "You drew me not as a doctor, not as a scientist, but as a man." Mabel looked at him, her heart full of a new, a different kind of knowledge. The knowledge was not of death, but of love. The knowledge was not of sorrow, but of hope. The knowledge was not of a curse, but of a blessing. "I drew you as you are," she said, her voice soft, "and as you will be." She had not broken the curse. She had not found a magical solution. She had simply changed the narrative. She had taken a story of terror and turned it into a story of triumph. She had taken a gift that had destroyed her family and turned it into a tool for healing. She had found a way to live with her terrible knowledge, not as a victim, but as a survivor. She was no longer Mabel the medium, the girl who drew her family's portraits before each one died. She was Mabel the artist, the woman who drew her family's portraits to help them live. And her story, a story of psychological terror and human resilience, was finally at its end.